I want to talk about the number one difference between entrepreneurs who are beginners versus entrepreneurs who are seasoned, who are both making pivots, right? I want to talk about the difference between being an employee and pivoting into entrepreneurship and kind of being an aspiring or a new entrepreneur versus what it takes to pivot when you are a seasoned entrepreneur, right? You've been in business for a decade or better, right? And how pivoting is very different and how not recognizing it, not recognizing this difference will have you taking the wrong advice, will have you doing the wrong things, and will have you on a hamster wheel when it comes to time for you to pivot. Okay. But if you can make this one change, you will execute more effectively. You will execute faster, right? More consistently. And most importantly, regain momentum quicker. Okay. All right. So I saw this video, and in essence, the man was talking about it taking him years to start creating content because he felt like he needed to get clear on what to say. Okay. That was the main first part of the video. And then he goes on to say it's all bullshit, right? He says the second part of the video is talking about how the simple act of getting started when he felt unclear created the clarity. Okay. And I want to address both messages. Okay. Because when I hear this, when I watch this video, it makes me think of all the people who say, just jump and build the plane on the way down. Or maybe they're not even telling you to jump and build the plane on the way down. They're just telling their own story about how they jumped and built the plane on the way down. Or a lot of this advice that's just like execute. And here's what I want you to see is that this is good advice for people who are getting started. Why? Because it gets you out of fear. It helps you get out of overthinking. It helps you not procrastinate, right? If you are getting started, then the simple act of going out and doing the thing can yield some clarity. Okay. But this is not good advice for most people who listen to this particular podcast. Why? Because most of the people who listen to this podcast are not new. They're not new entrepreneurs. This is not great advice for people who are seasoned. That's what I want you to hear. And here's why. Okay. Business growth happens in stages. That means you could be listening to great advice, right? On the internet, on a podcast, in a book, etc. That does not apply to you. This is the number one reason why what you're doing isn't working for you. Right advice, wrong stage. Why? Because business growth happens in stages, which means, and every single stage requires a different strategy. And that's why when I hear people say this isn't scalable, I often just roll my eyes because there's such a thin line between considering scaling versus actually being in a scaling stage. So yes, it's not wrong to oh, I don't want to do this marketing strategy. I don't want to do this sales strategy because it isn't scalable. It's okay. You definitely should consider that to some degree, but you should not be considering it to the degree that you are actually considering it if you're not in a scaling season. Why? Because business growth happens in stages. What you do when you're starting a business is very different than what you do when you're scaling a business. But unfortunately, in the online space, everyone uses scaling as a catch-all term. And so most of you all are not scaling. Scaling requires that you already have something actively working. And all you're really going to do is throw gas on it in all kinds of ways, be it team, be it traffic, be it whatever. It's like the idea of balancing long-term and short-term thinking as an entrepreneur, which again, most entrepreneurs are not good at. They tend to lean one way or another. Right? So I'm not saying don't think about scaling. I'm not saying don't think about this question of, is this scalable? I'm saying you need to have a greater balance of thinking about, is this scalable and recognizing the actual season and stage that you're in, right? If you don't learn to balance the two, you will continue to make decisions that don't fit the stage that you're in. You will continue to make decisions, take action that don't fit the season that you're in, and then get results that you do not like. Okay. If you are in a season, and let me just say, this is tricky because the season that you're in, if you're pivoting, is not a season that's even talked about. So how would I even know what I should be doing to be successful? Not just to be doing on a day-to-day basis, but what do I need to be doing in a shifting season? Because that season is not talked about. It gets talked about starting a business, growing a business, scaling a business. But what about shifting a business? I'm getting ready to do a whole series about that, but just a whole different podcast. Okay. For now, if you're in this season where clarity of direction is your primary focus, right? Then definitely check out our free 5-day email course where I talk about this concept in detail. Okay. Here's what I really want you to take away from this is that execution is great for overcoming fear, overcoming procrastination. It is great for multiple things. It is not, and I want to repeat, not great for getting clear. I know people tell you just execute, but that's like all the people who I see who just post content month after month after month after month, and they don't get clients from their content. They're executing. Every entrepreneur I know works 50 hours a week. Not every, some of them don't. Some have a little more boundaries, a little more successful. But even the clients who love, like they're literally making tons of money, they still work 50 hours a week. They just do it because they want to, not because they have to. That's the difference. And what I want you to be able to see is that execution is not your problem, friend. This idea of, because again, the first part of his message was all about, it took me years to start creating content because I felt like I needed to get clear on what to say. The second part was his whole message was just start. And you'll get clear as you move. And while there is some truth to that, it's not a completely, it's not the best way to get clear. That is literally how you end up posting content for months on end and still not making any money. It's like, in theory, it could work. And for somebody, somewhere, it did work. But for the vast majority of people, you can't just jump in and execute and expect to get great results. Jumping and building the plane on the way down, or throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, is a great strategy for getting you into motion, getting you out of fear, but it will rarely produce the results that you're looking for. It needs to be coupled with something. I'm not eliminating execution, but that in and of itself will not get you the results that you're looking for. That's why people work 12-hour days and they're still paycheck to paycheck. It's, oh, this person is working very hard. Why are they not further along? Because execution is not the key to every problem, right? This is why you have to understand the problem that you're trying to solve in your business, right? For example, when you are pivoting, the primary problem that you are trying to solve is a clarity problem. Whereas if you are in a different stage, you could be starting or growing or scaling, whatever, right? You likely have some things that you probably need to get clear about, but that's not your primary problem, right? So if you name the problem wrong, you will also use the wrong solution. So you have to name the problem accurately so you can find the solution that actually works. And when you are pivoting, the primary problem that you have is a clarity problem. So how do we solve a clarity problem? We just go out here and start executing. You could. It will eventually yield some return. It really will. It's just not the most effective way to do that. The problem is that practitioners use execution and effort to solve every problem that they have, even when they don't want to. A lot of entrepreneurs are tired of hustle culture. Like, they tired. They don't want to do no more executing than what they have to do. Okay. Practitioners are people who essentially work directly with customers or clients, depending on whatever field that you're in. And almost everyone starts in their business this way. Everyone starts as a practitioner. 90% of entrepreneurs will start this way. And not only will they start this way, it's often the thing that they love the most. The average coach or consultant really loves working with the clients, right? And because they love working with the clients, they tend to lean certain ways in their decision making and in their execution, right? Practitioners lean towards effort, they lean towards execution. But the thing is, business, I want to say this, business, not employment, okay? But business requires that you step into being a pioneer and stop being a practitioner. And not stop as in never do any effort or never do any execution or never work directly. No, I'm not saying all or none. I'm saying that you have to stop using effort and execution as your primary way of solving all the problems that you have in your business. Right? I remember when I first started early, maybe a year or two into my business, I started this series called From Coach to CEO, right? Which is essentially the same principle, right? At the time, I was working with aspiring coaches, new coaches. They were new to business, right? And they all wanted to build these coaching businesses, which is great. We love a good coaching business. But what you don't realize is that you actually have to step into the CEO role. And it's how the heck do I do that? I've never been a CEO. Fair. But if you don't learn to do it, your money will reflect it. You will have built another job for yourself. I was thinking, I have another client that I'm thinking of who wanted to pivot. She was a photographer and she was just trying to figure out how to basically be happier, right? I'm working really hard, all these things, blah, blah, blah. And a core part of our conversation was, all right, what does it look like to build out the strategy to get to the revenue and some of these other goals that she had? And the problem was the strategies that were going to get her to the kind of money that she wanted to make required her to step out of being a photographer and more into being a CEO. Again, don't hear me say eliminate. I'm not saying this is not an all or none. What I am saying is that if you spend 90%, 95% of your time shooting images and photos, you're not going to make the money that's practitioner, right? You're actually doing the work. We still need to do that kind of work, but it can't be the entire focus. The analogy that I use inside of the 5-day free email course is that practitioners, it's like I use the reference of building a house, right? And so when you're a practitioner, you're just focused on, all right, these walls need to go up. Listen, don't get me to using construction language because what I ain't finna do is build a house. Okay. But you know all the stuff that's gotta happen. You know what I'm saying? When you're building a house, you got to put the walls up and the roof and all the stuff you put in the wall, the installation, the electric, the plumbing, all that kind of stuff, right? That's the kind of stuff that practitioners focus on because that's stuff that you can see. But I just want to remind you, thinking like a coach or a practitioner will drastically reduce your personal income and your profitability. What we actually want to do is to become a pioneer or what we call an industry leading pioneer or CEO if we were going to use the coach to CEO reference, right? Because pioneers and CEOs, they don't use effort as their primary way of getting things done, right? I had a client, we were talking about this not too long ago, and we were talking about this concept of moving from practitioner to actually philanthropist, right? So we have a framework that goes from practitioner to philanthropist because all of my clients are givers. They're high impact people. They just want to give. And so it's a 3-step process: practitioner, pioneer, and philanthropist, which maybe at some point I'll do a whole podcast about it if people are interested. DM me, let me know, and I'll do it. Okay. But in this conversation, we were talking about making the jump, making the leap from pioneer to philanthropist. And one of the things that she said in the conversation was, I don't really see myself as a leader. Now, dramatic pause. I just want that to sit with you for a second. Now, to be clear, this is someone who's ultra successful in their business, right? They've started multiple companies, they sold multiple companies, right? She definitely saw herself as a visionary. right? She very much was a leader, right? But she was not owning or operating as such. That's what I want you to be able to hear. You have pioneers are industry leading pioneers. They're leading. Guess what? Leaders don't do every single thing in the company. Again, effort and execution is important, but they're not out here trying to do every single thing in their company. So, what do pioneers and CEOs use that coaches and practitioners do not? It is their thinking, it is their mind. We call it design. We're not talking about planning, we're not talking about manifesting, right? Both of those things have a place. But what I'm specifically talking about when we're trying to make this transition and we're trying to say, okay, if I'm not supposed to use execution, right? If I'm in a pivoting season and I'm trying to make sure that my strategy matches the stage that I'm in, right? And in our world, we often say this is like your ambition has to match your capacity. Then what is it that we need to do here? And it's, oh, we actually need to focus more on design when you are pivoting. So if we use the house reference that I said earlier that we talk about in the email course, what we talk about is the different types of labor, right? The person who works in construction, who actually builds the house has one type of execution, has one type of labor, right? But guess what happens? What's the most important part of building a house? First of all, we could argue about what's the most important part. And what I would say, the question is less about what's the most important part and more what's the most important sequence. Because guess what a contractor cannot do, right? The person, let's just say that you are a contractor who actually builds the things. I don't know what people are called who build houses, but I'm gonna just call them contractors for the sake of this episode, okay? Even though we could be called contractors as business owners, depending on how you look at it, okay? But just go with this reference for a second. Let's say the contractors who are actually building the house have a certain kind of labor, but they need the architects that draw up the plans to build the house in order to build the house. The architects who are involved in the building house process are also executing, and they also have a form of labor. It is just different labor. And what I'm trying to tell you in this episode, more architect, less contractor. You're operating as a practitioner without the architecture that leads the execution. We call this strategy first, speed second. What I want you to be able to see is that design, which is what pioneers and CEOs use to solve their problems, they act as architects more than they go off and they act as contractors. Right? I'm going to do a whole different episode that just talks about design, right? Because it is a completely missed phenomenon in the entrepreneur space. But when you are pivoting, it is one of the most important things you can do. It really is, because you're building a house. And this is the most important part. If you want the second half of your life, if you want this business to be your legacy business, and by legacy, I just mean you don't need to pivot again. Like it does what you need it to do, whether it's impact does what you need it to do, profitability. Like again, we're trying to build a solid foundation. And you can't build a solid foundation based on execution. It has to start, it's sequential, right? One of the things that we talk a lot about is compound psychology, which is our science-based methodology for building impactful brands. And one of the main core principles is that you have to stop doing everything simultaneously and learn to do things sequentially. Because when you learn to do things sequentially, things compound. When you don't, they're just scattered and they're chaotic. Okay, enough of my TED Talk. Here's my closing remarks, okay? My first closing for those of you who are church people, okay? When we only focus on the main 3 stages of growth, or the main 3 stages of business, start, grow, and scale, right? We miss a major component. Each of these 3 stages of business have their own requirements. Again, but the one that doesn't get talked about enough is the stage between grow and scale, which is shift, which is the pivoting. And it doesn't talked about a lot because not everyone goes through this stage. Some people literally start a business, grow a business, and scale a business, the same exact company, and move. Think there's tons of people who fall in this category that they might be making tweaks and pivots inside their existing company, of course, but they're not starting new businesses. They're not doing new niches. They're not. It's like there's a big difference between I'm expanding my market versus I'm starting a new market. And because there are lots of people who don't experience these shifts, it just isn't talked about enough. But there are plenty of people who do. Many people shift and pivot their business in a major way, or a completely different business for that matter. And when you're in a season of shifting, you are being invited to move from coach to CEO, from practitioner to pioneer, which means using effort and execution as a tool in your arsenal, but not as the only or even the primary tool, right? What you have to learn to do is to use design, aka thinking and strategy, as your primary tool. Right. So if you need help stepping into this, you can either check out our free 5-day email course, which I mentioned before at the beginning of this episode, or you can apply for Helper School, because that's exactly what we do in Helper School. It's specifically for pivoters, and it's specifically to help you with this design thinking so you don't get trapped in execution.